But want to get your perspective, Mike, on maybe some of the good, some of the bad. From your experience, where does Salesforce really stand up as an opportunity for folks to leverage in the world of CS, and then maybe where it doesn't, and maybe talk a little bit about this data warehousing problem and why the data it needs to live in a different place, where that kind of starts and stops.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll start off with just the CS side of it and then move over in towards the data warehousing side of it. In the CS world, Salesforce does a lot of things very well. And I think one of the biggest things that Salesforce does well is it can provide structure and automation around processes that you have within your organization. So I think Salesforce, if you're looking at something like onboarding, you might be tracking onboarding in an Excel sheet today, which is a great place to start, but at some point in time, you're going to want to move that over into Salesforce to be able to capture what's going on as part of the onboarding process. What was the handoff like from sales to CS? What tasks do they need to complete throughout the onboarding process? If they're short on those tasks, send an email directly to these people to let them know they're falling behind and lagging behind in onboarding. I always go towards onboarding first as the first thing to get into Salesforce, because I think it is so important in a SaaS-based business. You have to have that time to value. The longer it takes for somebody to recognize that time to value, they're already at a churn risk at that point in time. So onboarding is an incredibly important one to capture within Salesforce, but there are so many others. Just things like renewals. That's something where if you tie that in with a tool like CPQ, or even if you don't have a tool like CPQ, renewal is a completely different process from a new business process. And yet so many times I see just one record type where it's the same sales process. They're completely different. I think looking at account health, so we've talked about that piping in from other systems, but you can store that in Salesforce and be able to report on that, be able to trigger off notifications that makes people's lives easier to see this client was healthy a month ago and now they're not. What has happened? It allows not only the CSM to dig in, but their boss and other people up the management chain as well. And one other big piece that I always think of from the CS world that's relatively easier to implement is just gathering feedback, and not only gathering feedback, but actioning on the feedback. So oftentimes, I mean, how many times do we have an NPS survey where we sit there, say some things that, oh, we're not really a big fan of this project or this product, never hear from them ever again. If somebody's giving you feedback that is negative, that is absolutely a chance to learn from that. And if you're capturing that in Salesforce, you can see that over time, and you can see that in multiple different areas. Maybe they had a bad support experience. Maybe they had a bad onboarding experience. Maybe some new release they're not really understanding in some way, shape, or form. If you're tracking that in one place, ideally Salesforce, you can sit there and you can action on it. So those are some examples of certain things that I think are really important to capture in Salesforce. From a data warehousing perspective, we had a question there, which would you tackle first, a data warehousing or a CS tool? I think data warehousing first, because Salesforce is not built to be a data warehousing tool because you have to pay for storage. So if you want to store all your data in Salesforce, you could, but you're going to pay a whole lot of money for that as time goes on. Data warehousing, storage and data warehousing is so much cheaper in comparison to Salesforce that you're going to want a tool that stores data from a whole bunch of different locations in a data warehouse that you can then sit there and aggregate and pipe out to other places, like a tool like a Domo or a Tableau to run visualizations on, or even back into Salesforce at that point if it's from your software. Data warehousing is going to support the entire organization. It's going to support literally every piece of it in some way, shape, or form. And that's something that Salesforce is not built for that. You can build out Salesforce to manage these CS functions without a CS tool. And you can probably learn a whole lot in the process about how to further optimize those so that when you go to a CS tool, you're all good to go at that point in time. But data warehouse, I think, is a very underrated and a very incredible tool that most organizations can take advantage of.
Yeah. It's great. Yeah. And I'll add to that. I think when you start looking at leveraging your product usage data and you really get into some very granular transactional level data, I think that's where you really start seeing these data warehouse strategies really become useful and pertinent. And I also think, I've heard conversations as well as, if you have a tool if you have a CS platform, I think in the same way that Salesforce can become your data warehouse, I think you could get in the same trap with Gainsight or other large platforms to say, I'm going to store all my data here as a CS person, and all my data is here. It's all I need. And you forego the opportunity to see how you can aggregate the data that you have in Gainsight and other tools like your product and other auxiliary tools as well, to really support the organization and push data effectively without running into high costs for storage. And you really get more control of that as you go. But I will say also, I think you work your way towards that, right? And I think, in Joshua's instance, I would imagine they're proving things out. And so whether you're trying to prove that out in a point solution or you're proving that out through some custom build in Salesforce, just understand that there's a point at which you need to start that conversation on the data warehousing. And I don't think it should discourage you from getting started somewhere. But it's definitely a principle and a reality that will become an issue for you down the road.
I'd be remiss if I didn't wear my data security hat and say, before you're looking at data warehousing solutions and whatnot, it would be a good idea to tackle data governance. We were talking about governance earlier, but data governance within your organization, because data propagates everywhere, and it can be very, very much a risk increase to the organization. So wearing my data security hat there, that's important to tackle before you implement a solution for data warehousing.